On a Tuesday morning outside Hargrove Plaza, an 8-year-old girl selling handmade baskets with her aunt heard two men near a billionaire's car, speaking in a language they never expected a child to understand. What she heard made her blood run cold. And what she did next, grabbing a stranger's sleeve and saying 3 words, set off a chain of events that would expose an international conspiracy, reopen a cold case that had stolen her father from her, and force one of the most powerful men in the world to confront just how close he came to never walking out of that building again. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The city was already moving at full speed by 8 in the morning. Delivery trucks crawled through the narrow side streets near Hargrove Plaza. Pigeons scattered off the sidewalks whenever someone walked too fast, and the smell of coffee drifted from the little cart on the corner where a man named Lou had been selling drip coffee and stale muffins for 11 years. It was an ordinary Tuesday in every way that mattered, except for the girl sitting cross-legged on the low stone wall beside her aunt's folding table, watching everything. Her name was Zuri Bennett. She was 8 years old, and she noticed things. Not because anyone had told her to, not because it was something she practiced. She just always had, ever since she was small enough to sit in her father's lap while he read the newspaper and pointed to things. Look at that man's shoes, Zuri. What do they tell you? Look at the way that woman is holding her bag. Is she relaxed or worried? Her father had a way of turning the whole world into a question. She'd grown up looking for the answers. Her aunt, Renee Bennett, was arranging handmade baskets on the folding table the way she did every Tuesday and Friday. Renee made them herself. Coiled sweetgrass and pine needles, stitched tight with careful hands. And she sold them here outside Hargrove Plaza because foot traffic was good and the building management had never told her to leave. Zuri helped. She handed baskets to customers, made change from the little tin box, and when business was slow, she sat on the stone wall and watched the world. That morning, the world gave her something interesting to watch. A convoy of black cars, 3 of them, long and polished like they'd never once driven on a dirty road, pulled up to the plaza entrance just before 9. They came in tight formation, close enough that you could tell it wasn't an accident. Someone had planned the spacing. The lead car stopped at a precise angle in front of the revolving glass doors, and before the engine had even fully cut out, men in dark suits were already stepping onto the sidewalk. Zuri counted them. 6. Then 2 more from the back car. 8 total. She watched the way they moved. Crisp. Deliberate. Like they'd rehearsed it. "Auntie," she said. "Big meeting today?" Renee glanced up from the table. "Must be. That's the coal building." She straightened a basket and didn't look again. Zuri kept watching. The man who came out of the building a few minutes later was the kind of man people noticed. Not because he was loud. He wasn't. He didn't wave or call out to anyone. He walked like someone who knew exactly where his feet were going to land before they got there. He was tall, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like it had been made specifically for his shoulders, and his face had the kind of stillness that came not from being relaxed, but from having learned a long time ago to keep his expressions to himself. She would find out his name later. Adrian Cole, 42 years old, CEO of Cole Dynamics, a tech company whose name appeared on the kind of buildings that made whole city blocks look different. He was the sort of billionaire who didn't much look like the idea of one. No flash, no theater, just presence. He spoke briefly to a woman with a tablet as he walked, then handed her a folder without breaking stride. 2 of the security men fell into step beside him, and the rest fanned outward in a pattern Zuri recognized as deliberate. She'd seen police do something like it on television. You put bodies between the important person and everything else. He was heading for the lead car. Zuri's attention drifted, the way it sometimes did when the subject moved too far away. She looked at a woman walking a dog, at Lou refilling his coffee urn, at a group of men near the curb beside the lead car. She stopped. There were 2 of them, dressed like the others, dark suits, earpieces, the whole look. They stood close to the car's rear door, and from a distance, if you were busy, if you weren't Zuri, you'd assume they belonged. But they were talking. Not into earpieces, not reporting something. They were talking to each other. Quietly. The way people talk when they don't expect to be heard. And they weren't speaking English. Zuri's father, James Bennett, had spent 3 years working overseas for a logistics contractor before she was born, and another stretch when she was very small. He'd picked up Russian the way practical men do. Not beautifully, not with grammar books, but functionally enough to manage. And he'd taught her pieces of it the same way he taught her everything else, by weaving it into ordinary moments. Good morning while she ate breakfast. Be careful when she crossed the street. Small words, small phrases, repeated until they were part of her. She didn't speak Russian. but she understood more than anyone who looked at her would ever guess. She tilted her head, very slightly, the way she did when she was trying to hear something over the street noise. One of the men said something low and quick that she almost missed, but she caught the last part clearly. Cactoco on Cyadet, VSE Proizoidet Bistro. Once he's inside, it happens fast. She sat very still. The words moved through her the way cold water does, slowly, then all at once. She turned them over, checked them, the way her father had always told her to do when she heard something she wasn't sure about. Don't react to what you think you heard. Hear first, then think. She had heard it. Once he's inside, it happens fast. Adrian Cole was maybe 30 feet away, still talking to the woman with the tablet, maybe 15 seconds from reaching the car. For a moment, Zuri didn't move. She thought about what adults did when children interrupted them. The sighing, the polite dismissal, the look that said, "You don't understand, sweetheart, this is grown-up business." She thought about how many times she'd said something true and had it wrapped back up and handed to her like a gift they didn't want. But her father's voice was louder than all of that. If something feels wrong, speak. Even if your voice shakes. Even if no one listens. You speak. She was off the wall and moving before she'd fully decided to move. She crossed the sidewalk at a near run, weaving between two people who turned to look at her. One of the security men stepped toward her immediately. She saw him shift, saw his hand come up, but she was already past him, reaching the edge of the circle around Adrian Cole, grabbing the sleeve of his jacket with both hands. "Don't get in that car." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Adrian Cole stopped walking. He looked down at her with the expression of a man who was very busy and had just encountered something he hadn't scheduled. Not unkind, just measured. "Excuse me." Two security men were already there, one reaching for her shoulder. Hey, let go. "Don't get in that car," she said again. And this time she looked directly at Adrian, not at the men trying to move her. Those two men by the door. They were speaking Russian. They said once you're inside, it happens fast. The security man had her by the upper arm now, firmly but not roughly, already steering her away. "Okay, come on, kid. Wait." Adrian's voice was quiet, but it stopped the security man cold. He crouched slightly, so he was closer to eye level with her. Not all the way down, but enough that it wasn't condescending. "What did you say?" "Repeat it." She repeated the phrase. In Russian, as close as she could remember it, the sounds fitting in her mouth the way her father had taught her place them. Something changed in Adrian Cole's face. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a gasp or a flinch. It was more like a small door closing, a very deliberate shutting down of expression that told her, in the way that only people who pay attention can read, that he understood exactly what she just said and that it had landed somewhere serious. He straightened up. He turned to the man on his left, the older one with the silver tie. "Thomas." He said it quietly, just the name. Thomas was already moving. Zuri looked back toward the two men near the car. One of them was watching her now. Not the distracted glance of someone curious, but the fixed, alert look of someone recalculating. His hand moved toward his ear, toward the earpiece, a small and careful gesture. Not panicked, controlled, but she saw it. Adrian didn't get in the car. He stood for a moment on the sidewalk while Thomas moved close to him and spoke in a low voice. She watched Adrian nod once, very slightly. Two of the other security men had moved to positions near the car, casual enough to look routine, deliberate enough to block the doors. One of the two men near the car, the one who had looked at her, said something to the other. Then they both began to walk away, unhurried, the way people walk when they're trying not to look like they're leaving. Thomas made a phone call. 8 minutes later, 2 police vehicles were parked at the edge of the plaza, and a man in plain clothes was on the ground beside the lead car with a flashlight, looking underneath. Renee had come off the sidewalk by then, arm around Zuri's shoulders, saying, "What did you do, baby? What is happening?" in the voice she used when she was scared but trying not to show it. Zuri watched the man with the flashlight. He stood up and spoke to Thomas. Thomas went immediately to Adrian Cole. The device was there. Magnetic trigger. Tucked up under the driver's seat frame, where you'd never see it unless you were looking, and unless you knew what it was when you found it. Adrian Cole stood in the morning light outside Hargrove Plaza, surrounded by people speaking in urgent, controlled voices, and for just a moment his eyes moved across the crowd to where Zuri stood beside her aunt's basket table. He didn't say anything yet, but the way he looked at her, it was the way her father used to look at her when she'd figured something out that surprised him. "There you are," it said. "I see you." By midday, what had started as an ordinary Tuesday had become something else entirely. Something contained and controlled on the surface, but humming with tension underneath, like a wire pulled tight. The police kept the scene quiet. No press. No announcement. The official story, released to building management, and the small number of bystanders who'd come close enough to notice the police presence was a routine security sweep following an unspecified tip. 2 officers stayed near the plaza entrance for an hour, then left. The black cars were moved to an underground garage. To anyone walking past Hardrow Plaza that afternoon, there was nothing to see. But Renee's folding table was gone by 11, and she and Zuri were not at home by noon. Thomas Garrett, Adrian's head of security, 16 years on the job, former federal agent, a man who spoke in carefully chosen sentences, had explained the situation to Renee with a calm that was clearly practiced. There was a safety concern, precautionary only. They would be moved to a secure location for a short period while the situation was assessed. Everything would be explained. They would be comfortable. Renee had held it together until they were in the car, and then she'd gripped Zuri's hand hard enough that Zuri felt her rings. The safe location was a serviced apartment on the 14th floor of a building 3 miles from the plaza. It had clean carpets, a full kitchen, a window that looked out over the city, and a door that locked from the outside as well as the inside. A woman named Patricia, calm, efficient, clearly not administrative staff, brought groceries and stayed in the living room with a tablet on her lap. Zuri sat at the kitchen table and ate a sandwich and thought. She thought about the 2 men and the way they'd walked away. She thought about the phrase, once he's inside, it happens fast, and what that meant specifically and whether she'd heard it right. She had. She knew she had. She thought about the look on Adrian Cole's face when she'd repeated it, and what it meant that a man like that had stopped, turned around, and listened to a girl from a sidewalk basket stall. Mostly she thought about her father. James Bennett had died 3 years ago. Zuri had been 5. The details came to her in the way early childhood memories always do. Not as a complete picture, but as fragments, sensory and sharp. The smell of his jacket, the sound of his laugh, the way he said her name, with the emphasis on the second syllable, like it was something precious. Tsuei. He had died overseas. The official word from the contractor company was an accident, a vehicle accident during a logistics run in a region where accidents happened. There had been paperwork, condolences, a small life insurance payment that had not been enough and had run out. Renee didn't talk about it much, because talking about it made her cry, and Renee did not like to cry. Zuri had always felt that the word accident sat wrong. It had a shape that didn't fit, like a key that turned, but didn't unlock anything. She hadn't known what to do with that feeling at 5, or 6, or 7. She was 8 now, and she still didn't know what to do with it. But she held it carefully, the way you hold something you don't want to drop. It was early evening when Adrian Cole arrived at the apartment himself. Zuri had not expected that. She'd expected Thomas, or Patricia, or another comm professional with a tablet and a practice tone. She had not expected the man who ran Cole Dynamics to take the elevator to the 14th floor personally, knock on the door himself, and come in carrying 2 cups of coffee and a juice box. He handed the juice box to Zuri without making a production of it. He sat across from Renee at the kitchen table and was direct in a way that seemed to be simply how he communicated, not brutal, but undecorated. He told her the device had been confirmed. He told her the 2 men were being sought. He told her that he took the threats seriously, that he took Zuri's safety seriously, and that he intended to see this through properly. Renee had a lot of questions. He answered every one of them. When Renee excused herself to use the restroom, Zuri suspected she needed a minute to collect herself, which was something Renee did in private. Adrian Cole looked across the table at Zuri. How do you know Russian? He asked. My dad taught me. She picked at the edge of the juice box. He worked overseas. He said learning pieces of a language was like learning pieces of a person. You understand more than they think you do. Something moved across Adrian's face. Not quite a smile, but close. He was right. He died, she said, not to wound, just because it was true and she didn't see a reason to avoid true things. 3 years ago. I know. Thomas pulled your family's background this afternoon. Standard procedure. I'm sorry about your father. She nodded. That phrase you heard, he said. You were certain? I heard it twice. The second time was clearer. She looked at him evenly. I know I'm 8. I know you are too. He said it without any of the dismissiveness she'd been bracing for. I was 12 when someone told me something important that nobody believed. It didn't go well. She waited. So I believe you, he said simply. Back at Cole Dynamics headquarters, in a long conference room on the 31st floor where the walls were glass and the city spread out below like a circuit board, there was a meeting happening that was considerably less calm. Thomas Garrett stood at the head of the table. Around him were 6 people, executives, board members, the company's internal legal counsel, and they were not, by any stretch, all reading from the same page. A man named Douglas Fitch, chief financial officer, gray-haired and perpetually cautious, kept circling back to the same point. The market doesn't know, and it cannot know. Any public acknowledgement of a security incident involving Adrian Cole would send the stock sliding, and they were 3 weeks from closing the European acquisition, the biggest deal in the company's history. Timing was everything. Disclosure was a disaster. Across from him, the head of corporate compliance, a sharp woman named Karen Ashby, kept saying with increasing firmness that the opposite was true. A cover-up that came out later, and it would come out, was catastrophically worse than a controlled, carefully worded statement now. She used the word fiduciary 4 times. Between them, everyone else was picking a side, or trying not to. Thomas let them talk. He was thinking about the memo. Someone had known Adrian's travel schedule that morning. Not just the general outline. Adrian was leaving the building, heading to the airport for a meeting in D.C., but the specific vehicle, the specific departure time, the specific route. That kind of information didn't live outside the company. It lived in 3 places: Thomas's own team, the executive calendar system, and a small group of senior staff with schedule access. He'd already quietly pulled the access logs. He hadn't told Adrian yet. He wanted to be certain. The anonymous message arrived on Adrian's personal cell phone at 9:47 that evening. It came from an unknown number that, when Thomas's team ran it, resolved to a burner registered to a gas station in rural Georgia 4 months ago. The message was 6 words. Next time she won't be there. Adrian read it once, then set the phone face down on the desk in the apartment's 2nd bedroom, where he'd been working while Renee and Zuri slept. He sat with it for a moment. Then he picked the phone back up and forwarded it to Thomas. He thought about what it meant that whoever had sent it was already thinking about Zuri. That changed something. A threat against him was one thing. That was a known risk in his world, the kind of thing that came with the territory of the amount of money and influence he had. He'd navigated threats before. He learned not to let them change his posture or his pace. But a threat that referenced a child, that landed differently. He opened his laptop and spent the next 2 hours reading everything Thomas had already compiled about the 2 fake security guards. The picture was thin so far. Both men had entered the country 6 weeks ago on what appeared to be legitimate contractor credentials. A company called Vantage Security Solutions, incorporated in Delaware, with a website that looked real from the outside and collapsed like cardboard the moment anyone pushed on it. Shell company. The kind that took less than a day to construct if you knew what you were doing. One of the 2 men, the one who had made the quiet gesture toward his earpiece, had a partial face match in the contractor firm's registry. Not a current employee. Former. Temporary engagement, 8 months ago, on a contract that had overlapped with a Coal Dynamics facility access project. Someone inside facilitated access. Thomas had written those words in his report summary with no drama, the way Thomas did everything, but Adrian stared at them for a long time. Zuri woke up early and lay in the unfamiliar bed in the unfamiliar room and listened to the city outside the window, which sounded the same as it always did. Cities didn't change because something dangerous had happened near them. That had always seemed slightly unfair to her. She thought about the message she didn't know about yet, but would. She thought about what it meant to have heard something and to have acted on it, and whether the acting on it had made things better or worse. If she hadn't said anything, Adrian Cole would have gotten into that car, and the thing under the seat would have done what it was meant to do, and that would have been that. If she had said nothing, she would not be here, in this apartment, with a security woman in the living room and her aunt sleeping across the hall with the door slightly open. Saying something had saved his life. Saying something had also made her visible to the people who wanted him dead. She understood that clearly, in a matter-of-fact way, that children sometimes understand hard things better than adults expect. Not because they're unafraid, but because they haven't yet learned to soften reality into something more comfortable. She was afraid. She was 8, and she was afraid, and she didn't think that was wrong. But she was also something else. Something she didn't quite have a word for yet. The feeling of having done the right thing and having it mean something, even if it had complicated everything. Her father would have known the word for it. She got up and went to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water and stood at the window. 3 miles away, Thomas Garrett was sitting in front of a monitor looking at a piece of surveillance footage from the plaza's eastern camera, an angle nobody had thought to review until 40 minutes ago. The footage was time-stamped from 47 minutes before the convoy arrived. It showed one of the fake guards walking the perimeter of the plaza entrance. Routine. Expected. But behind him, for 3 seconds, a face visible in the window of a parked car. A face that Thomas recognized. He'd worked alongside that face for a long time. He pulled the image, enhanced it, looked at it for a solid minute. Then he opened a new secure channel and began composing a message to Adrian. Before you see anyone tomorrow, I need to show you something first. Outside the window of the 14th floor apartment, the city moved the way cities do, indifferent and continuous, carrying the weight of everything happening inside it without slowing down for any of it. Zuri drank her water and watched the lights. She was 8 years old, and she had already changed the shape of things in ways she couldn't fully see yet. But she would. The surveillance image Thomas had pulled from the plaza's eastern camera sat at the center of everything that came next. A 3-second frame of a face behind glass that hadn't been meant to be seen. Thomas didn't show it to Adrian immediately. Not because he was stalling, but because Thomas Garrett had spent 16 years in this work, and he understood that the worst thing you could do when you found something explosive was to throw it at someone before you'd built the structure around it. Evidence without context was just noise. He wanted context first. So while Zuri stood at the kitchen window of the 14th floor apartment watching the city lights at 6 in the morning, Thomas was already 3 moves ahead, doing the thing he did better than anyone Adrian had ever employed. He was being quiet and thorough in a world that was moving fast and loud. By the time Adrian came downstairs to the apartment's main room that morning, Thomas had 2 things waiting for him: a cup of black coffee and a secure tablet with a file on it that he suggested Adrian read before they spoke to anyone else. Adrian read it standing up. He didn't sit down until he was finished, and when he sat, he was still for a long moment. "You're certain it's him?" Adrian asked. "The facial match is 87%. Camera angle and window glare limit the ceiling on that number. But I've worked alongside this person for years, and I'm certain." Thomas said it flatly. He didn't editorialize. Adrian set the tablet down. "Who else has seen this?" "No one. Keep it that way until we have more." Thomas nodded. That had already been his plan. Within 48 hours, Adrian had quietly engaged an outside firm, a private intelligence outfit called Meridian Group, run by a former NSA analyst named David Hartwell, who operated with a small team and a reputation for finding things that didn't want to be found. Adrian had used Meridian once before, 3 years ago, during a corporate espionage dispute that had never become public. Hartwell didn't ask unnecessary questions, and he didn't speak to anyone who was in the room. Hartwell and his team got to work alongside the official police investigation, which was moving at the pace of official investigations, carefully, procedurally, with appropriate documentation at every step. Adrian respected that process. He also knew it wasn't going to be fast enough. The 2 tracks ran parallel, separated by a careful wall, each feeding the other only what Adrian decided to pass through. On the 3rd day, Hartwell's team surfaced the financial thread. It started, as these things often do, with something small and slightly wrong, a series of wire transfers modest in size, moving between accounts in a pattern that was designed to look like vendor payments. A consulting invoice here. A software licensing renewal there. Each one individually unremarkable. Together, when you laid them end to end and looked at the timing, they told a different story. The transfers were routed through a chain of shell companies. 3 of them dissolved within 60 days of receiving funds. The trail passed through Delaware, then Cyprus, then a numbered account in Latvia. Hartwell's analyst had seen this architecture before. It was a cleaning mechanism, the financial equivalent of wiping fingerprints, but it had been built in a hurry. Hurried work left gaps. The source of the funds, traced backward through the chain, linked to a holding entity that appeared twice in the Coal Dynamics vendor registry. Once for a building maintenance contract, once for an IT services agreement. Both contracts had been signed internally, approved by someone with mid-level authorization, buried in the operational budget where no one was looking closely. Someone inside approved those contracts. Hartwell told Adrian during a briefing in a rented office space 3 blocks from the plaza, chosen specifically because it had no connection to Coal Dynamics. That person either created the shell companies or was the intended recipient of the payments. We're working on establishing which. Adrian turned that over carefully. Were the contracts signed? Hartwell slid a page across the table. The dates were 8 months ago and 4 months ago. The partial match in the contractor registry, the one Thomas had found, was from an engagement 8 months ago. The timeline fit together cleanly, and cleanly fitting timelines were never an accident. Zuri had been at the safe apartment for 4 days when Adrian arrived one afternoon with a bag of books. Not educational texts, not the kind of serious titles someone picks up when they're trying to make a point about being helpful. Just books. 3 novels, a collection of illustrated geography facts that she immediately flipped to the pages on Eastern Europe and the Caucasus region, and a paperback on the history of codes and ciphers that he said he'd read himself when he was about her age and which he thought she might find interesting given recent events. She looked at that one for a long moment, then looked at him. "You read this when you were 8. 10, he admitted. "But you seem ahead of schedule." It was the first time she'd laughed since the morning at the plaza. Renee watched this from the kitchen doorway with an expression that mixed gratitude and wariness in roughly equal measure. She was a practical woman who had learned not to trust large things being given freely, because in her experience they usually came attached to something. She'd said as much to Adrian during their second conversation, directly enough that it had surprised him, not unpleasantly. He'd told her, the only thing you wanted from Zuri was to make sure she was safe. Everything else, her time, her trust, her future, was hers to decide about. Renee hadn't fully believed him then. She was starting to, slowly. That afternoon, while Renee rested, Adrian sat with Zuri at the kitchen table while she worked through the geography book. She had a habit of asking questions that weren't really questions, statements shaped like inquiries, the kind that indicated she'd already started forming an answer and wanted to test it against someone else's thinking. "The two men," she said, not looking up from the page. "They weren't from Moscow." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "What makes you say that?" She turned a page. "The way they said certain sounds. My dad worked near the western regions. He said the accent from near the Baltic border sounds different from Central Russian. Harder consonants. The vowels get shorter." She looked up at him. "One of them had that. I noticed it when he said the part about timing." Adrian kept his expression neutral, but inside something sharpened considerably. "You're sure?" "I noticed it at the time, and I've been thinking about it since." "I'm sure enough." She said it with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who had learned to trust her own observations and hadn't yet been talked out of it by the world. He excused himself for approximately 4 minutes, during which he made a call to Thomas, who relayed the information to Hartwell's team within the hour. The geographic detail, if it held, would narrow the network considerably. Western Russia, near the Baltic corridor, pointed toward specific organized networks with documented ties to corporate and political espionage in Eastern and Northern Europe. Hartwell had a list of 3 such networks active in the current period. Zuri's detail cut that to 1. Meanwhile, Renee's world had gotten considerably harder. She had shut down her stall for what was initially supposed to be a few days and had become, without anyone formally announcing it, an indefinite arrangement. She wasn't complaining. The apartment was comfortable and Patricia was helpful, and she understood the seriousness of the situation. But she had customers who relied on her baskets for gifts and events, and she had a lease on a storage unit where she kept her materials, and she had a life that did not pause easily. She started getting calls from people who'd heard something had happened near the plaza. Nothing specific, just the way neighborhood information travels, distorted but directional. She told everyone she was visiting family. She didn't like lying. She was not naturally built for it, which was something Zuri had inherited. One evening, after Zuri had gone to bed, Renee sat in the living room with Patricia and said, quietly and without drama, "How long does something like this usually take?" Patricia, who had seen enough of these situations to know that honest answers were kinder than comfortable ones, said, "It depends on what they find and how quickly they can act on it." Renee looked at the locked door. "My niece saved a man's life," she said, "and now we're the ones locked in." Patricia didn't have an answer for that. Some truths didn't need one. On day 6, Hartwell's team found the memo. It was an internal document, 3 pages, marked confidential, distributed via the company's encrypted internal system 8 days before the assassination attempt. The subject line was a routine notation about Adrian's quarterly travel schedule, departure times, vehicle arrangements, security protocols for each leg. Standard operational planning. The distribution list was short. 5 names. 5 executives at Coal Dynamics who had received that specific document in that specific form. Thomas pulled the list, cross-referenced it against access logs, confirmed that no copies had been forwarded outside the original 5 recipients. Whoever had provided the fake guards with Adrian's precise schedule, down to the vehicle and departure time, was one of those 5 people. Thomas brought the list to Adrian that evening. Adrian read the 5 names slowly, the way you read something you don't want to misread. He knew all of them. Of course he did. 3 had been with the company for more than 7 years. 1 had hired the other 2. They'd sat across from him in board meetings, and across from him at dinner tables, and across from him in every difficult moment the company had faced. He handed the list back to Thomas without speaking. "We don't move on any of them yet," Thomas said. "Hartwell wants 48 more hours to establish which of the 5 had contact with the shell company accounts." 48 hours, Adrian confirmed. He spent that night in the rented office space, working because the apartment felt too small for what was inside his head. He thought about trust. Specifically, he thought about the ways it failed. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but slowly and from the inside, the way something rots from the core outward while the surface looks fine. He'd been betrayed before. Not at this scale, not with this kind of consequence, but the texture of it was familiar. He recognized the particular weight of finding out that someone who knew your schedule, your habits, your exits, and your entrances had been quietly building something against you. What he couldn't settle was why. Greed was the obvious answer, and it was usually right. But the financial amounts he'd seen in the shell company trail were not the kind of money that moved a senior executive. They were operational payments, logistics, coordination. The real money was elsewhere, and it was pointing at something larger than any one of those 5 people. He made a note for Hartwell. Follow the money past the 5. There's a principle behind this. He didn't know yet how right he was. 48 hours became 72, and then a week, and by the end of that week, the careful quiet that Thomas had built around the investigation had developed a crack. It began, as leaks often do, with something small and unverifiable, a rumor circulating in the lower frequencies of the financial press that there had been a security incident involving a Coal Dynamics executive. No names, no specifics, just the shape of something. The kind of story that gets picked up by a mid-tier industry newsletter and sits there harmlessly until someone with more resources decides to pull the thread. Douglas Fitch called Adrian at 7 in the morning to say that 2 journalists had made inquiries through the company's PR department asking for comment on an unspecified security matter. Adrian told him to have PR issue a standard no comment on unspecified inquiries, which was true in its way, and to report back if the inquiries became specific. Fitch, predictably, turned the conversation to the acquisition timeline. The European deal. 3 weeks away. Any instability in the market's perception of the company. Douglas, Adrian said, I'm aware of the timeline. The board is asking questions. Tell the board I'll address their questions at the scheduled meeting and not before. He ended the call. In the executive offices of Coal Dynamics, among the remaining 4 people on the 5-name memo distribution list, Fitch himself was one of them. The atmosphere had quietly curdled. Each of them knew about the security investigation in general terms. None of them knew about the memo. None of them knew they were each looking at the others with a newly careful eye, reading expressions, weighing words, doing the quiet arithmetic of suspicion. Karen Ashby told her assistant to pull 6 months of internal communications for review, framing it as a compliance audit. Standard practice, plausible cover. Her assistant noticed she'd come in 40 minutes early every day that week. A senior VP, named Robert Calloway, started forwarding everything through legal review before sending, even routine memos. He told no one why. Fitch himself had begun, quietly, to document his own movements and decisions with a specificity he'd never bothered with before. Whether this was guilt or self-protection, Thomas couldn't yet determine. The 5th person on the list was Marcus Hale. Zuri was not supposed to know about the investigation specifics. That had been the agreement. Adrian with Thomas, Thomas with Patricia, Patricia with Renee. She was a child, and she was under protection, and the appropriate thing was to keep her insulated from the details while they worked. This plan had a flaw, which was that Zuri was Zuri. She had a way of picking up information from the edges of rooms. Not by eavesdropping deliberately, just by being still and present and overlooked the way observant children often are. She caught pieces of phone calls, fragments of conversations, the way adults' voices changed when they were dealing with something real versus something routine. She knew the investigation had found a paper trail. She knew it was pointing inward at someone inside the company. She knew, from the particular tension in Thomas's posture on the 2 occasions he'd come to the apartment that week, that it was pointing towards someone specific. She didn't ask anyone to confirm it. She filed it away and waited. On the 9th day, she was sitting at the kitchen table working through the codes in Cypher's book when Adrian came in the afternoon and sat across from her, and she could tell from the set of his jaw that something had shifted. She closed the book. Can I ask you something? She said. He nodded. Do you feel guilty that I'm here? She said it carefully, not accusingly. Like, that I'm stuck in this place because I said something? He was quiet for a moment, and she could tell he was deciding whether to give her the easy answer or the real one. She watched him choose. Yes, he said. She considered that. I don't, she said. In case you were wondering. He looked at her. I'd do it again, she said. Knowing everything. I'd still go over there and grab your jacket. She looked back at the book. My dad said the right thing and the comfortable thing are almost never the same. You just have to pick which one you can live with. Adrian sat with that for a long moment. He sounded like someone I would have liked to know, he said. Most people liked him, she said. He was good at listening. Something moved across Adrian's face. A brief softening, the kind that came and went quickly in people who'd learned not to let things land too visibly. He was quiet for a beat longer than usual. "Zuri," he said, "there's something I should tell you. Your father, some things have come up in the investigation. About where he worked. About the company he worked for." She looked at him steadily. "What kind of things?" "Not enough to tell you yet. When I know more, I'll tell you everything. I promise." She studied him. 8-year-old children were, in her experience, told a version of things, not the full shape. But Adrian Cole had a way of looking at her that was different from how most adults looked at her, like she was a person in full, not a small version of one. She decided to believe him. "Okay," she said. The direct attack came on a Wednesday afternoon. Their convoy, Adrian's vehicle and a follow car, was heading back toward the rented office from a brief meeting with Hartwell 3 miles away when the car that had been sitting at a light 2 blocks back began to follow. Thomas, in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, noticed it inside 45 seconds. He said nothing to Adrian, just made a small adjustment. Not the planned route, a different one, and he watched the car adjust with him. He made one call, low-voiced, and within 3 minutes there was a police unit and one of Meridian's vehicles moving to intercept. The car was a rented sedan, registered to a name that would turn out to be fabricated. The driver, when stopped, had no weapon drawn but had one within reach, and there was a second person in the back seat who turned out to be the more significant of the two, a man who carried no identification, whose fingerprints would later match a European database entry connected to a network of private contractors with a history of corporate intelligence work. No shots. No confrontation that rose above the level of a traffic stop from the outside. Clean, controlled, contained. Thomas reported it to Adrian in 3 sentences on the drive back. Adrian processed in silence, then said, "They're escalating." "Yes," Thomas said, "because we're getting closer." Thomas didn't answer that, because it wasn't a question. Back at the company, the 5-name list had effectively ceased to be an abstraction and become an active wound. Robert Calloway and Douglas Fitch had their first openly hostile exchange in a board prep meeting. Sharp words about resource allocation and internal communication that were superficially about logistics and were actually about the fact that both men had started to look at each other sideways. Karen Ashby had reported the exchange to Adrian's office via Thomas, adding that the dynamic was deteriorating faster than was useful. Adrian called a brief executive meeting, not confrontational, just present. He said the right things. That the investigation was being handled, that he expected professionalism from everyone until it was resolved, that the company's performance and the acquisition timeline were unchanged. He made eye contact with each of them in turn. He lingered, fractionally, on Marcus Hale. Marcus Hale was 60 years old, trim and precise, silver-haired in a way that suggested authority without effort. He had been with Adrian for 12 years, first as a consultant, then as chief security advisor, a role he'd shaped himself, defining its scope and its boundaries as the company grew. He was not a man who raised voices or lost composure. He had a quality of stillness that Adrian had always read as competence, and now, with the weight of what Thomas had shown him, was reading differently. Marcus held his gaze during the meeting without blinking and without any visible discomfort. That steadiness, which had always been reassuring, was now the most troubling thing in the room. After the meeting, Adrian walked to the window of his office and stood looking out at the city below. He had known Marcus Hale for 12 years. Marcus had been in the vehicle with him during the kidnapping threat in 2019, had stayed calm, had made the right calls, had physically interposed himself between Adrian and danger. That was not a performance. You could not fake that kind of courage in real time. And yet the forensic trail was leading somewhere it should not be able to lead. He thought about what it meant to trust someone for over a decade, and then find out that trust had been built over something hollow. He thought about the specific pain of that, the way it didn't just change the present, but reached backward and recolored everything that came before. He hadn't let himself fully go there yet. He was still in the phase of hoping the evidence was wrong. Hartwell's forensic team delivered their analysis on day 11. The shell company accounts had 1 degree of separation from a consultancy firm in Richmond, Virginia, a small operation that, on paper, provided corporate risk analysis services. It had 3 clients. It had been in business for 4 years. Its registered agent was a woman named Deborah who had no background in corporate risk and whose name had been used, it appeared, without her full understanding of what she was signing. The firm's founder, and its only active principal, was a man named Carl Whitmore. Carl Whitmore was Marcus Hale's brother-in-law. The payments from the shell companies to Whitmore's consultancy had been made at 3 intervals over the past 8 months. The first payment preceded the building maintenance contract by 11 days. The second preceded the IT services contract by 8 days. The third, the largest, was dated 6 days before the assassination attempt. Thomas laid the report on the desk in front of Adrian without a word. Adrian read it twice. He set it down. He stood up and walked to the window again, because standing at windows had become the thing he did when he needed his body to do something while his mind processed something enormous. 12 years. He turned back to Thomas. Where is he? In the building. Meeting with his team. Don't move on him yet. Not here, not today. He picked up the report again. I want to be in the room when it happens. And I want everything in order before we walk in. Thomas nodded. And the convoy incident. The men who were stopped. Any link to Marcus directly? We're still establishing that. But the network they're tied to has appeared twice in other documents that reference the same Estonian corridor operations. Hartwell believes it's all one structure. Estonia. The word sat there quietly, meaning nothing to Adrian yet. In a few days, it would mean a great deal. That same evening, Zuri was looking through the surveillance footage on the tablet Patricia had left unlocked. Accidentally, though Zuri had her quiet suspicions about that, and she was not looking for anything specific, just looking the way she always looked at things. She was watching the plaza footage from the morning of the assassination attempt. She'd asked to see it twice before and had been gently redirected. This time, there was no one to redirect her. She watched the convoy arrive. She watched herself on the screen, small and quick, coming off the stone wall. She watched Adrian stop walking. She rewound to before that. She watched the approach from the building entrance, the way the security formation moved, the way the path from the revolving doors to the lead car was shaped. She watched Marcus Hale, visible in the background, speaking to a colleague near the building entrance. She watched him glance, just once, brief and casual, at the lead car, then at his watch, then toward the revolving doors. Then, 2 minutes before Adrian appeared, she watched Marcus Hale take a single step to his left and say something to one of the official security team standing near the route. A small gesture, easy to miss. The security guard nodded and adjusted his position, and in doing so, the open corridor from the revolving doors to the lead car became 3 feet wider and more direct. He hadn't pushed Adrian toward the car. He'd cleared the path. Zuri sat with that for a long time. Then she went and knocked on Patricia's door. I need to show you something, she said. Patricia watched the footage 3 times without speaking. The first time she was looking at what Zuri was pointing to, the small leftward step, the word to the guard, the corridor widening. The second time she was looking for reasons it meant something other than what it appeared to mean. The third time she picked up her phone and called Thomas Garrett. She didn't describe it in detail over the phone. She said, "You need to come here tonight." Zuri found something on the plaza footage. She paused. "Bring Mr. Cole." They came within the hour. Adrian watched the clip 4 times, each time with a stillness that became progressively more absolute. The kind of stillness that wasn't calm, but was the controlled containment of something that wanted very badly to move. Thomas watched it once, then stepped away to the window, and the set of his shoulders said everything his face didn't show. Zuri sat at the kitchen table and watched them watch it. She had not been wrong. She'd learned enough about the way adults responded to things to read confirmation, even in silence. "He didn't push you toward the car," she said, when no one had spoken for a minute. "He cleared the way so you'd take the path that went past it naturally. So it would look like you chose it." Adrian turned from the screen. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize, the one that combined something like respect with something like grief. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what he did." The following morning, Adrian called Marcus Hale to his office. Not Thomas's office, not a conference room, not a neutral space. His own office, the one on the 32nd floor with the long windows and the desk he'd had since the company's first real building, moved from location to location as cold dynamics grew around it. He wanted Marcus in that room because it was the room where they'd had every serious conversation for 12 years. And because Adrian believed, perhaps stubbornly, that honest confrontations should happen in honest places. Marcus arrived at 9:15. He wore the same kind of suit he always wore, well-cut, dark, nothing showy. He sat in the chair across the desk without being asked, the way he always had, and folded his hands in his lap. "Marcus," Adrian said. "Adrian." There was a pause that lasted several seconds and felt much longer. "I'm going to show you something," Adrian said, "and I want you to tell me what I'm looking at." He turned the tablet to face Marcus and played the plaza footage. Marcus watched it without visible reaction. Not the careful watchfulness of someone preparing a lie. Something flatter than that. Exhausted, almost. Like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a long time and had arrived at the moment when he would have to set it down. When the clip ended, he said, "You know what you're looking at. I want to hear you say it." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, The evidence your team found, the shell company's Carl's firm. I know about that too. I've been watching your investigation nearly as closely as you've been running it. Carl Whitmore is your brother-in-law. He is. The payments went through his firm. They did. Adrian leaned forward. 12 years sat between them in the room like a physical thing. Did you know about the bomb? Marcus's eyes came up for the first time and met his directly. No, he said it with a force that was different from everything else he'd said. Not loud, but unambiguous. I want to be clear about that. I knew about the plan to destabilize you, the cyber attacks that were coming, the smear campaign they were building. I did not know they intended to kill you. When I understood what had actually been under that car, he stopped, pressed his lips together, started again. That was not what I agreed to be part of. But you cleared the path. I was told it was a tracking device. That once you were in the vehicle, they could monitor your movements and find the right leverage. I believed it because I needed to believe it. Adrian sat back. The distinction Marcus was drawing between knowing and choosing not to know was the kind of distinction that was legally meaningful and morally thin. Adrian understood both of those things simultaneously. Why, he said. The single word carried everything. Marcus looked at the desk for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, lower, stripped of its professional surface. 3 years ago, someone approached Carl. He was in financial trouble. Not catastrophic, but serious enough that he made a bad decision. He took money from people he shouldn't have. When I found out, I tried to extract him from it. The people he was involved with made it clear that extracting him was not an option. He paused. They had documentation. Things that would have destroyed Carl's family, my sister's marriage, my sister's children. They said if I cooperated, provided access, provided schedule information when they needed it, Carl's debt would be cleared and the documentation would disappear. He looked up. They lied about the bomb, he said. I don't expect that to matter legally, but it is the truth. The room was very quiet. Adrian thought about the 2019 kidnapping threat. Marcus in the vehicle, steady and quick, putting himself in the path of danger without hesitation. He thought about the dozens of conversations in this room, the decisions made together, the trust extended and received over more than a decade. He thought about what it cost a person to carry 3 years of this. How long have they been coercing you? He asked. The first request came 37 months ago, and you told no one. I couldn't. Marcus said it simply, without self-pity. The documentation they had, it would have destroyed people who had nothing to do with any of this. I made a calculation. I kept making it. Adrian stood up. He walked to the window. Below, the city moved with its usual indifference. Thomas is going to come in, he said, without turning around. And we're going to do this properly. You understand what that means. Understand, Marcus said. I need you to give them everything. Every contact, every request, every piece of information you passed. Everything. I intend to. Adrian turned back around. He looked at Marcus for a long moment. Not with warmth, not with cold, but with the particular expression of someone who has arrived at a truth they did not want and are choosing, deliberately, to hold it steady. I don't forgive this, he said, but I believe you about the bomb. Marcus nodded once. Then he picked up his company-issued phone, set on the desk, and placed his credentials badge beside it. He stood up. He straightened his jacket. And he waited. Thomas entered the room 4 minutes later. He did not look surprised to find Marcus sitting there quietly, badge on a desk. He had spent 12 years working alongside this man, and he had spent the last several days building the case against him. And both of those things were true at once. And Thomas Garrett did not resolve contradictions by pretending they didn't exist. He sat down, placed a recorder on the desk, and said, "Let's start from the beginning." Marcus talked for 3 hours. What the 3 hours produced was a map. Not complete. Marcus had operated in a deliberately limited field of vision, sharing only what he'd been directly asked to share, knowing only what he'd been directly told. The coercion structure was designed that way. Compartmentalization. But what he did know had edges that touched other edges, and Hartwell's team was already triangulating between Marcus's account and the financial and forensic evidence they'd built independently. The result was a picture with a large hole at its center. Marcus had never met the principal. He'd dealt with intermediaries, 2 of them, both of whom had been careful to remain formally unidentifiable. He knew the operation had a significant financial backer, someone with deep interests in the defense technology sector, someone who stood to benefit enormously from the collapse of Adrian's European acquisition. He knew the name that had been used in internal references among the intermediaries when they thought Marcus wasn't noting it down. He'd been noting it down for 3 years. He said the name. Hartwell, patched in via secure line, was quiet for 2 seconds. Then, that's what I was afraid of. Before the formal detention process could be completed, Marcus was gone. not in a panicked, disorganized way, in a way that suggested preparation. His parking card was used at 6:17 that evening. His company phone was left on the credenza in his office next to a handwritten note that said, "Only I will come back to this when I can," and the building's exit cameras showed him walking out of the parking structure on foot, turning left and disappearing from frame. Thomas had expected this possibility. He planned for it. Tracking was initiated within minutes. But the trail went cold with a speed that told them Marcus had known exactly where the cameras were, which of course he did. Adrian sat in his office at 8 that evening and looked at the empty chair across from his desk. He told Zuri he would give her full information when he had it. He was not yet there, but he was close enough to see the shape of it. And the shape of it was larger and darker than even he had anticipated when this had started as a bomb under a car seat 11 days ago. 2 days after Marcus disappeared, the cyber attack hit. It came at 3 a.m. on a Thursday, which was when these things always came, when systems were least monitored and human reaction time was slowest. The attack targeted Cold Dynamics' proprietary AI infrastructure, specifically the systems that contain the technical specifications for the European acquisition integration. Not the financial data, not the communications. The technical architecture. The intent was clear. Compromise the technical foundation of the acquisition, give the acquiring targets board grounds to pause or withdraw, and in the resulting chaos, make the company's shares vulnerable. Cold Dynamics' cybersecurity team caught it inside 90 seconds, which was exceptional. They contained it inside 4 minutes. The damage was minimal but not zero. Some peripheral data was accessed, logs were copied. A small section of the integration roadmap was exposed. Adrian was awake by 3:08. He'd stopped sleeping heavily since the plaza. He spent the next 4 hours in the company's security operations center watching his team work, saying nothing, letting them do what they were paid and trained to do. At 7, when the all-clear was confirmed, he called Hartwell. "The attack tonight," he said. "Same network." "Almost certainly. And it tells us something. They've shifted from physical removal to destabilization, which means they believe direct action is now too exposed." Hartwell paused. "They're accelerating toward the acquisition deadline. They need this to collapse before it closes." Adrian thought about what Zuri had said. He hadn't told her yet that this was what she'd unlocked, that the Russian she'd heard that morning had been about timing, about a window, about a specific countdown. But she had told him, days ago, something about the guard's words that now carried more weight than ever. 3 days after the cyber attack, in a safe apartment on the 14th floor, Renee Bennett made a decision. She sat Zuri down at the kitchen table, poured herself coffee she wouldn't drink, and said, "I've been looking at apartments. In Charlotte, near your cousins." Zuri looked at her. "We have options," Renee said. "This doesn't have to be our only option. We can leave. We can build somewhere else. We don't have to stay in the middle of this." She said it gently, the way she said everything hard, not as a command, but as an offering. A door she was holding open. Zuri was quiet for a long time. Outside, the city made its noise. Traffic and wind and the distant sound of someone somewhere doing something ordinary. "I want to see it finished," Zuri said. Renee looked at her. "Dad tried to do something," Zuri said. "He saw something wrong, and he tried to do something about it. And then he died, and nobody finished it. Nobody went back and fixed it." Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something she was keeping level by effort. "I don't want to leave before it's finished." Renee didn't say anything for a moment. She was the kind of woman who understood that some feelings didn't need fixing, just witnessing. "Okay," she said quietly. "We stay." She picked up the coffee she hadn't meant to drink and drank half of it. Adrian had been careful with the information about Zuri's father. He'd asked Hartwell to pull whatever existed on James Bennett's overseas work before he brought it to her, because he wanted to understand it himself first, and because he had made a promise to tell her everything and he intended to keep it. What Hartwell found took several days to compile. James Bennett had worked from 2011 to 2014 as a logistics analyst for a multinational contractor called Barrick International, a company that managed supply chain operations in several Eastern European and Central Asian regions. Barrick was a legitimate company. It also, during the period James worked there, had been used as a conduit for a small but significant side operation, the covert movement of dual-use technology components through falsified shipping documentation. James Bennett had noticed it. He'd flagged it internally in the spring of 2014, a memo to his direct supervisor noting irregularities in 3 specific shipment manifests. The supervisor's response had been to reassign him, quietly, to a different region. 3 months later, James Bennett was dead. A vehicle accident on a rural road in a country where roads were bad and accidents happened. The contractor's accident report was thorough, and the conclusions were clear, and the insurance payment had been processed within 30 days. Hartwell's analyst had pulled the original accident report, and then, using a contact in the relevant country's transport ministry, had obtained the local road authority's independent incident report, which had never been formally connected to the contractor's version. The two reports described two different accidents. The contractor's version had a mechanical failure. The local version had a vehicle that had come to rest in a position inconsistent with the described failure. Hartwell had put this in a folder marked Bennett for Adrian's review first and said nothing else because there was nothing else to say yet. Adrian came to the apartment that afternoon with the folder in his bag and the weight of it in his posture. Renee, who had developed a precise sense for when things were about to become harder, excused herself to take a walk with Patricia. He sat across from Zuri and placed the folder on the table. "I promised you everything when I had it," he said. "I have some of it now. Not all, but I won't keep the part one half from you." She looked at the folder. She didn't reach for it. "My dad," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He found something, didn't he? That's why he died." Adrian looked at her steadily. "We believe so. Yes." She took a slow breath. She placed both hands flat on the table in front of her, palms down, the way her father used to do when he was thinking something through seriously. "Tell me," she said. He told her. He kept it clear, and he kept it honest, and he didn't soften the parts that needed to stay sharp. He told her about the shipping irregularities, about the internal memo, about the reassignment, and the timing. He told her about the two accident reports and what the discrepancy between them suggested. He did not tell her the conclusion as a certainty. He told her it as what it was, a strong and terrible possibility that still needed formal verification. When he finished, the room was very quiet. Zuri stared at the table for a long time. Then she said, "He tried to do the right thing. Everything we've found says yes. And they killed him for it." Adrian didn't answer that directly. He said, "We are going to find out, definitively, what happened to your father. That is a commitment I'm making to you now." She looked up at him. Her eyes were wet, but her face was level. "Thank you for telling me yourself," she said. "I told you I would." She nodded. She looked back at the table. After a moment she said, very quietly, "I'm glad I stopped you." "So am I," he said. "More than you know." Hartwell's Estonia lead had been developing for several days in the background, fed by the combination of Thomas's tracking of Marcus's disappearance and intercepted communications from the same Baltic Corridor network Zuri's accent observation had identified in Act 3. Marcus Hale had not simply fled. He had gone somewhere specific. The tracking trail, partial but directional, pointed toward Tallinn, Estonia's capital. Not to a safe house or a temporary location, but to a specific set of meetings. Hartwell's contact in European intelligence confirmed that a private consortium had been gathering there over the past week. Investors, intermediaries, and at least two individuals with documented connections to corporate intelligence operations in Northern Europe. "Marcus isn't hiding," Hartwell said during the briefing. "He's meeting." Adrian stared at the map on the screen. "Who with?" "The consortium. The people who pressured him, we believe. He may be attempting to renegotiate, to use the information he has as leverage." Thomas, who had been listening from the doorway, said, "Or he went there to trade what he knows about our investigation for protection." "Possibly both," Hartwell said. "He's not a stupid man. He knows we're close. He knows we have enough to act. If he's at this meeting, he either believes he can make a deal or he has no other move." Adrian looked at Thomas. "We can't let that consortium know what we have," Adrian said. "If they think we're closer than we are, they accelerate. If they think we're further than we are, we have time." Hartwell nodded. "Which is why I want to propose something." The plan that Hartwell laid out over the next 2 hours was precise in its simplicity. Adrian would issue a public statement, carefully worded, leaked through a channel that would appear credibly unintentional, suggesting that the security investigation had reached a dead end, that no internal wrongdoing had been substantiated, and that Adrian himself was considering stepping back from day-to-day operations temporarily to allow the acquisition process to complete without distraction. Not a resignation. A strategic retreat, publicly performed. The message it would send to the consortium, their pressure was working. The campaign was succeeding. Back off and wait for the acquisition to collapse on its own. The message it would actually mean, the investigation was 3 moves ahead of where they thought, and the window they believed they were exploiting was closing from the other side. "It gives us 72 hours, Hartwell said. "Maybe 90. While they're recalibrating, we finish building the case." Adrian looked at the statement draft on the screen. It was a careful piece of writing, true in its technical details, false in its implications. He was not accustomed to public misdirection. He had built his reputation, in part, on saying what he meant. He thought about the bomb under the seat. He thought about the cyber attack at 3 in the morning. He thought about Zuri's father's accident report and the vehicle at rest in a position that didn't match the story. Run it, he said. The statement went out through a financial journalist who had a reliable history of receiving and publishing unattributed corporate communications, the kind of channel that the consortium would recognize as credible precisely because it was informal. Within 4 hours, Hartwell's monitoring team picked up activity changes in the target communications. The consortium's internal traffic, which had been running at an elevated operational tempo for the past 2 weeks, slowed. Certain encrypted channels went quiet. A meeting that had been scheduled for the following day was postponed. They were standing down. "It's working," Hartwell's analyst said. Hartwell looked at the data. "For now," he said. Marcus Hale, in Tallinn, did not stand down. He had arrived at the consortium meetings as Hartwell had predicted, not as a fugitive, but as a man with something to sell. Specifically, he had documentation. 3 years of it. Meeting records, payment confirmations, communication transcripts that he had been quietly assembling since the third time an intermediary had made a request that crossed a line he hadn't expected them to cross. He had not, contrary to what Thomas feared, gone to Tallinn to trade what he knew about Adrian's investigation. He had gone to Tallinn because it was the only place where the people who had coerced him were physically present, and because he had decided, sitting in that office with his credentials on the desk, that the only way to finish this properly was to be in the room where it could be finished. He did not fully trust his own motives. He knew he was frightened, knew that some part of what felt like courage might simply be the exhaustion of someone who had run out of other options. But he had the documentation, and the documentation was real, and in the meeting rooms of Tallinn, he sat across from intermediaries who believed he was there to protect himself and placed the folder on the table instead. "I want immunity," he said. "Formal, documented, irrevocable. In exchange for everything I have." The intermediaries looked at each other. "You're not in a position to make demands," one of them said. "I'm in a position to make this the most expensive folder in the room," Marcus said. "Or the most valuable. That's your decision." Zuri knew none of this in detail. But she knew something was shifting because she could feel it in the way the apartment's atmosphere had changed. Patricia was on calls more frequently. Thomas had visited twice in 2 days, and Adrian had a different quality to his attention when he came, focused and outward-facing rather than the inward-processing tension of the previous week. She had been thinking about what he'd told her about her father. She'd been thinking about it the way she thought about everything, not pushing against it, just sitting with it, letting it settle into its proper shape. Her father had noticed something wrong. He had said something. He had been careful. He had gone through proper channels. He had done everything a person was supposed to do. And the people with power had still found a way to silence him. That was the part that sat hardest. Not that he'd died. Death was a thing she'd had 3 years to begin to understand, though never fully, but that doing the right thing had not protected him. That the system he'd trusted to receive what he reported had either failed him or been complicit. She was 8 years old, and she understood that the world was not arranged to protect people who told the truth. She had known it before, in the abstract way children know things they haven't yet tested. Now she knew it specifically, viscerally, in the way that understanding lives in the body rather than just the mind. She sat at the window and watched the city and thought about her father's voice saying if something feels wrong, speak. He'd known it might not protect him. He'd done it anyway. That was the inheritance, not safety, courage. She would spend years understanding the full weight of that. But she was beginning to understand it now. On the 4th day after the fake statement, Hartwell intercepted a communication that changed the shape of everything. It came through the Baltic Corridor network, the same architecture that Zuri's accent observation had helped identify weeks ago. It was addressed to a routing address that Hartwell's team had been monitoring, waiting for traffic that would confirm the identity of the principal. The communication was brief, operational language, stripped of detail, but it contained a reference, a proper name, used once in a context that was unmistakably directional. Viktor Sokolov. Hartwell stared at the name on the screen for a long moment. Viktor Sokolov was not unknown to him. He was not unknown to anyone who operated in the intersection of international finance and technology. He was a Russian-born billionaire who had spent 15 years building legitimate business interests in Europe and the United States alongside a shadow network of investments that moved through the same kind of shell company architecture that Hartwell's team had been tracing for weeks. He was also, specifically, Adrian Cole's longest-standing competitive rival in the defense technology sector. Hartwell called Adrian at 11:30 that night. "We have a name," he said. "A real one." Adrian was quiet for 3 seconds. "Who?" Hartwell told him. The silence that followed lasted longer than 3 seconds. Are you certain? Adrian said. The communication is authenticated. The routing confirms it. We're certain enough to move. Adrian sat in the dark of the rented office for a long time after the call ended. Viktor Shokolov. He had competed against this man in 3 acquisition processes over the past 8 years. They had been in the same room at industry conferences. He had shaken his hand. He thought about Zuri. He thought about James Bennett's car resting in a position that didn't match the story. He thought about the bomb under the seat, the cyber attack at 3 in the morning, the anonymous message about the girl. He thought about how much had been destroyed by one man's decision to destroy rather than compete. He picked up his phone and sent a message to Thomas. Tomorrow, we move. But that night, before he slept, the consortium in Tallinn intercepted a piece of intelligence of their own, a fragment of communication from within Hartwell's monitoring network that suggested Adrian's investigation was further along than the fake statement had implied. The consortium sent word to Sokolov, and Sokolov, within the hour, sent word back. If he can't be removed physically, destroy his credibility publicly. 48 hours. The smear campaign broke at 6 in the morning. It didn't announce itself the way honest things do, directly, with attribution. It came in the way these things always come when someone with money and motive builds them carefully. A financial news outlet published a piece citing unnamed sources claiming Adrian Cole had misrepresented projected revenue figures to the European acquisition target. 40 minutes later, a separate piece on a different platform cited a different unnamed source claiming internal communications showed Adrian had concealed a material cybersecurity breach from aboard. By 8 o'clock, 3 more fragments had appeared across financial and tech press, each one different enough to look independent, each one pointing in the same direction. Alone, any one of them was manageable. Together, timed within 2 hours of each other, they had the coordinated signature of a single hand behind a spread of fingers. Adrian was already awake when Thomas called. He'd been awake since 5:30 because Hartwell had sent a preliminary alert the night before that traffic in the target network had spiked, which meant something was moving. It started, Thomas said. I see it. Karen Ashby is already in the building. Fitch is calling every 20 minutes. Tell Fitch I'll call him back. Adrian was already pulling on his jacket. Tell Karen to hold all press responses until I'm there. Nothing goes out. Not a statement. Not a no comment. Nothing until I say so. He paused at the door of the rented office. And call Hartwell. Tell him we need everything today. At the safe apartment, Zuri was eating cereal and watching Patricia's face. Patricia had a particular way of looking at her phone when news was bad. A slight tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible stillness in her shoulders. Zuri had cataloged this over 2 weeks of close quarters. She saw it now, clearly, at 7:15 in the morning. She put down her spoon. What's happening? Patricia looked up. She made a decision that Zuri recognized. The small internal shift of an adult choosing honesty over comfort. Someone is publishing false stories about Mr. Cole, she said. Financial misconduct allegations. They're not true, but they're out there. Zuri was quiet for a moment. She looked at the table. Then she said, the cargo route. Patricia frowned. What? The Russian phrase I heard. Zuri looked up. When I was remembering what the guard said, I remembered a second exchange after the first one. One of them said something about switching the cargo route. I told Thomas weeks ago, but I didn't know what it meant. She paused. Does it mean something now? Patricia was already picking up her phone. Thomas relayed it to Hartwell within minutes, and Hartwell, who had been staring at a wall of financial documentation for 72 hours, sat up straight. Switching the cargo route. In the logistics documentation they'd been tracing, there was a shipping company, a mid-size freight operator called Norland Transit, registered in Finland, that appeared in 2 separate threads. Once in the Shell Company payments trail. Once in an encrypted data transfer log that Hartwell's team had pulled from the cyber attack's access files, but hadn't yet fully decoded. The cargo route reference was a link. Not metaphorical, literal. Norland Transit had been used to physically transport hardware components whose shipping manifests concealed embedded data drives. The drives contained the encrypted transfers. The transfers contained the operational communications between Sokolov's intermediaries and the people running the destabilization campaign. Hartwell's analyst had the decryption key sitting in a separate file. She'd been waiting for the context to know which lock it opened. She opened it in 40 minutes. What came out was 312 messages spanning 14 months. Instructions, payment confirmations, strategy discussions, references to Adrian by name, references to the acquisition target, references to the assassination as the primary solution and the smear campaign as the contingency. And at the top of the chain, sending and receiving one account. Registered to a proxy, but fingerprinted by metadata, by phrasing patterns, by 3 specific references to personal details that match Viktor Sokolov's documented history. Unmistakably to one person. Hartwell called Adrian at 9:47. "We have him," he said. "Everything. Documented, authenticated, enough for international warrants." In the background of the call, Adrian could hear his legal team on another line, his PR team in the hallway, Douglas Fitch's voice somewhere down the corridor, being managed by someone patient. The smear campaign was doing its work in the press, and the company's stock had dipped 4 points in the first hour of trading, and the Acquisition Targets Board had sent a formal inquiry requesting clarification. None of that mattered now the way it had mattered an hour ago. "Send it to Thomas," Adrian said, "and patch in the international contact. It's time." Marcus Hale called Adrian's personal line at 11:15. He was still in Tallinn. His voice had the quality of someone who had not slept in 2 days and had made peace with that. "I have the documentation," he said. "All of it. 3 years. I've been in contact with a European intelligence liaison through a channel your team will be able to verify. I want formal immunity from prosecution in exchange for full cooperation and testimony." Adrian held the phone. He thought about the 12 years. He thought about the cleared path on the plaza footage, the bomb under the seat, the 3 years of past information that had built the architecture of everything that had gone wrong. He thought about what Marcus had said in the office. "They lied about the bomb. I'll have our legal team contact the liaison directly," Adrian said. "You'll be protected while the process runs. Beyond that, I can't promise you anything." "I'm not asking for a promise," Marcus said. "I'm asking for a process. A real one. You'll get that." There was a pause. "The name behind all of it," Marcus said. "You have it now. We have it." Another pause. Longer. "Good," Marcus said quietly. Then, "I'm sorry, Adrian. For what it's worth after everything. I know it isn't much." Adrian didn't say that it was fine, because it wasn't. He didn't say he understood, because understanding something and accepting it weren't the same thing. He said, "Come back and do this properly, Marcus. That's what matters now." The line went quiet. Then Marcus said, "I will." The international warrants moved with the kind of speed that only happens when multiple agencies have been quietly pre-briefed and are waiting for a final confirmation to act. Hartwell's intelligence contacts in 3 countries have been carrying the framework of the case for 72 hours, building the legal structure that would hold the documentation Marcus and Hartwell's team had assembled. By mid-afternoon, Sokolov's primary financial accounts were frozen. By evening, the asset freeze had extended to 14 subsidiary holdings across 4 countries. One remaining operative, a man connected to the same contractor network that had supplied the fake guards, made a move on Adrian's residence at 9 that night. He'd been tracked for 36 hours. Security was waiting. The breach attempt lasted less than 2 minutes before it was neutralized cleanly. No shots fired. The man detained and in custody before he'd cleared the outer perimeter. Adrian was not at his residence. He was at the rented office, watching events resolve in the center of the map he'd been building for weeks. The global financial press, which had spent the morning amplifying the smear campaign, began shifting by evening as the asset freeze story broke through legitimate channels. The false misconduct allegations were suddenly weightless, not because anyone retracted them formally, but because the context around them had collapsed. The story was no longer about Adrian Cole's alleged misconduct. It was about Viktor Sokolov's network and the warrants and the 14 months of documentation that told a story far larger than one acquisition. At 11 that night, Sokolov's legal team issued a statement through a proxy firm denying everything. The statement was 4 paragraphs of careful language, and it landed like paper in water. And then, through a channel Adrian had not anticipated, a direct message to his personal account from an address that Hartwell would later confirm was Sokolov's own, came 7 words. "You only survived because of the girl." Adrian read it once. He sat with it. Then he forwarded it to Hartwell, flagged it for the evidentiary record, and shut the laptop. Outside, the city was doing what cities do at midnight, carrying on, indifferent, continuous, the weight of everything happening inside it distributed so widely that no single point felt it all at once. Adrian felt it all at once. But he was still standing. Marcus Hale surrendered formally 3 days later. He came back from Tallinn the way he'd said he would. Not running, not negotiating through proxies, but walking into the federal building downtown on a Tuesday morning with his lawyer beside him and the documentation folder under his arm. He made a full statement. He answered every question. He named every intermediary, described every request, laid out the 3 years of coercion in language that was precise and unsparing. including about himself. The immunity agreement covered his cooperation testimony. It did not erase the record. He understood that had understood in Tallinn had come back anyway. Adrian was not in the building when it happened. He'd chosen not to be, deliberately. Not because he couldn't face it, but because Marcus's accounting was something that belonged to the legal process now, not to their personal history. Adrian had said what he needed to say in the office 12 days ago. He didn't need to be in the room for the rest. He was instead at the safe apartment with Zuri and Renee, telling them that it was over. Zuri received this with a stillness that had become familiar to him over the past 3 weeks. The deep, unhurried way she processed things, like water finding its level. Sokolov, she said, under formal international investigation. His network is being dismantled. It will take time, but it's moving. And my dad's case? A formal review has been opened. The 2 accident reports, the flag shipments, the timing. It's in the right hands now. I will stay on it until there's a definitive answer. He paused. I promise you that. She nodded. She looked at the table, then back at him. When you find out the full truth, you'll tell me yourself? Myself, he confirmed. First, she held his gaze for a moment in that measuring way she had, the way that always made him feel he was being assessed fairly, and then she nodded once, satisfied. 2 weeks later, Adrian held a press conference. He did not sensationalize it. He was not the kind of man who performed for cameras, and the story didn't need performance. It was large enough on its own. He laid out the facts: a coordinated assassination attempt, a corporate espionage network, an international financial conspiracy targeting his company's acquisition. He named Sokolov's network without editorializing. He acknowledged the cyber attack and the smear campaign and the role of domestic law enforcement and international intelligence in the response. He did not name Zuri publicly. Some reporters pushed on that point afterward. There were enough fragments circulating that the presence of a child witness had become a rumor in certain corners of the press. Adrian's answer was the same every time. A member of the public provided critical information early in the investigation. That individual's privacy will be protected completely. He meant it. He enforced it. The foundation was his own idea, developed over those 3 weeks at the rented office between briefings and legal calls, in the margins of the crisis that had consumed everything. He called it the James Bennett Foundation. Zuri's father's name on the letterhead, his photograph in the materials, his story told in plain language about a man who had seen something wrong, had spoken, and had paid an unacceptable price for that courage. Its purpose was simple: identify gifted children from underprivileged backgrounds and provide them with access. Real access, not symbolic access, to education, mentorship, and opportunity. Not as charity, as investment, as the acknowledgement that talent distributed itself without regard for circumstance, and the world was wasting an enormous amount of it by failing to look in the right places. He told Zuri about it before the announcement. He sat across from her at the kitchen table. They had spent more hours at that table than anywhere else, and he thought he would always associate that particular window, that particular light, with the most clarifying weeks of his adult life, and explained the structure and the name and what he hoped it would do. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "You named it after my dad." "He earned it," Adrian said. "Everything you did, the courage it took to cross that sidewalk and grab my jacket, that came from him. It should be acknowledged." She looked down. Her jaw tightened slightly, the way it did when she was holding something in that wanted to come out differently. Then she looked back up. "He would have liked you," she said. Adrian had been told many things in his professional life that had landed as meaningful. That one landed differently. "That means something to me," he said quietly. The acquisition closed on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the warrants had been issued, 2 weeks after Marcus's surrender, 1 week after Adrian's press conference. The European Defense Technology Firms Board had conducted their own review of the events and concluded, correctly, that the instability had been externally manufactured rather than internally generated. They closed on schedule, with a revised communication strategy that acknowledged the events and framed the partnership as, among other things, a demonstration of organizational resilience. The company's stock recovered its lost ground within 4 trading days and closed the acquisition week at a record high. Douglas Fitch sent Adrian a 3-paragraph email that was mostly about the stock performance and contained, in its final sentence, something that was almost an apology for the pressure he'd applied during the crisis. Adrian read it, sent a brief reply that was professional and warm, and said nothing about the almost apology, and moved on. Karen Ashby, who had been right about disclosure at every step and had said so without apology, was promoted to Chief Operating Officer 2 weeks later. She accepted without visible surprise. Zuri's access to education programs came through the foundation's first cohort selection, which happened to include her. Not as a gesture, but because she qualified unambiguously by every criterion the selection process applied. She was offered enrollment in an accelerated learning program at a school 40 minutes from where they lived, with full support for materials, transportation, and the kind of small practical things that made big opportunities either accessible or theoretical. Renee sat with the offer letter for a long time before saying anything. Then she said, "Your father would not be able to stand how proud he was right now." Zuri smiled. A full, unguarded smile, the kind that reached her eyes entirely. And for a moment she looked exactly like what she was, an 8-year-old child who had done something extraordinary and was also just a kid who missed her dad and was glad things had worked out. She asked, in the enrollment paperwork, to continue Russian language instruction as part of her program. The coordinator noted it without comment. Adrian, when he heard, laughed for the first time in weeks, a real one, unpolished, surprised out of him. "Of course she did," he said to Thomas. Thomas, who almost never smiled, almost smiled. Renee and Zuri were relocated at the end of the month. Not to a distant city, not to anonymity. Renee had made clear she was not interested in disappearing. But to a new apartment, in a building with good security, and a lease in a name that wasn't attached to newspaper fragments. In a neighborhood where Renee could restart her basket stall at a nearby market that had been asking for her work for 2 years. The move was framed, at Renee's firm insistence, as partnership rather than charity. Adrian had respected this without argument. The Foundation's community development arm had an existing program that provided housing stability support for families of honorees. Renee was eligible. She accepted on those terms and no others. She started at the new market on a Saturday, 3 weeks after the move. She sold out by noon. Adrian changed after this. Not completely, not instantly. Change that fast is usually just performance, but genuinely in the ways that matter. He became more visible in the communities his company operated in, not as a PR exercise, but with the specific attention of someone who had been reminded, concretely, that the people most overlooked were often the ones who saw the most clearly. He learned to ask different questions in hiring processes. He called Karen Ashby's judgment on things he would previously have decided alone. He told Thomas, once, that he intended to be less of a person who had to be convinced to trust, and more of a person who started from trust and adjusted accordingly. Thomas said, "That sounds like a significant risk." Adrian said, "It's a calculated one." Thomas, who understood calculated risks better than almost anyone, nodded once. The first Sunday of the following month, Adrian drove to a cemetery on the east side of the city. Zuri was in the passenger seat. Renee had stayed home. This was something Zuri had asked for, and Renee had understood without needing it explained. The grave was simple. James Bennett's name, his years, a small carved detail that Renee had chosen. A compass rose because James had always said knowing your direction was more important than knowing your destination. They stood there for a while without speaking. The morning was cool and clear, and the cemetery was quiet in the way cemeteries are quiet. Not empty, but still. Zuri placed a small paper on the headstone. She had written something on it in careful, deliberate handwriting. Adrian didn't read it. It wasn't his to read. After a while she said, "I think he knows." Adrian didn't ask what she meant. He understood. "I think so too," he said. They stood there a little longer. The wind moved through the trees at the cemetery's edge. Somewhere distant, a car passed on the street outside the gates, and the sound came and went like a breath. Months passed. The city moved forward the way cities do. On a bright Tuesday morning, not so different from the one where everything had started, a new convoy of black cars arrived outside Hard Row Plaza. Zuri was there, not at the basket table this time. She was standing on the steps of the building itself, waiting. She had a meeting inside. A session with the Foundation's education coordinator, her third in as many weeks. She was early, the way she was always early, because being early meant time to watch. She watched the convoy pull up. She watched the security formation assemble. She watched the revolving doors. Adrian came out looking the same as he always had, measured, purposeful, the city moving around him without touching him. He walked toward the lead car, and just before he reached it, he turned and found her on the steps. She looked at him. He paused. A single beat, half a second, no more, where he stood between the door and the world and looked at the girl who had crossed the sidewalk and grabbed his jacket on an ordinary Tuesday and changed the shape of everything. She nodded. He got in. The car pulled away into the city's morning traffic, and Zuri turned and walked through the revolving doors, her reflection flashing briefly in the glass. A girl moving forward, upright and sure, into whatever came next. If the person who saw the truth had stayed silent to stay safe, would justice have ever found its way to the people who needed it most? If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and stay close, because the next story is already waiting for you.